When approaching the Qur'an, students often have questions about passages that seem opposed to their own values. There are several verses in the Qur'an that contemporary audiences find troubling or difficult, but I will focus on one verse in order to demonstrate the different ways that contemporary Muslims approach scripture, as well as general problems that all communities face when interpreting authoritative texts from the past. The verse I have chosen comes from the 4th chapter of the Qur'an and is attributed to Muhammad's time in Medina, a period when Muhammad was leading a large and growing community. This verse deals with the relationship between married couples, husbands and wives. In order to tell you specifically what this verse says, I first need to address two intersecting issues. This verse, like all verses in the Qur'an, was originally transmitted in Arabic. In order to show you this verse in English, I have to translate the verse from one language into another. In order for someone to translate a passage, they must first interpret its meaning. In other words, we have to figure out what this verse means in Arabic before we can translate it into English. The process of determining the meaning of the Qur'an, or scriptural interpretation, began about a century after the death of Muhammad and has continued ever since. Prior to the 19th century, interpretation of the Qur'an was restricted to literate Muslims. These scholars, the vast majority of them men, debated the meaning of almost every word or topic in the Qur'an and differed drastically on almost every topic. However, all of these scholars did agree that men were superior to women and that husbands exercised authority over their wives. If I translate this verse according to the majority of classical interpretations, the verse looks something like this. Men are in charge of the affairs of women because God has preferred in bounty one of them over another. Righteous women are therefore obedient, and those whose disloyalty you fear, admonish them, then abandon them in their beds, then strike them. But if they obey you, then do not seek means against them. God is all high, all great. According to this interpretation, this verse explains that men have authority over their wives who should remain obedient to them. If those wives display disobedience to their husbands, the verse then seems to advocate for an escalating series of corrections that begin with scolding, continue to cutting off sexual relations, and then end with physical violence. Classical scholars debated many of the terms of this verse. Prior to the 19th century, all scholars agreed on the basic premise of a husband's authority over his spouse. Today, Muslims in general, and Muslim scholars in particular, do not agree on that basic premise. Like members of other communities, Muslims around the world hold a variety of different opinions on gender relations. Some do believe that men are superior to women and that husbands should have broad authority over their wives. Still others believe that men and women occupy separate, complementary roles, with each having authority over their own distinct spheres. And yet others believe that men and women should both be considered as equals and be granted equal authority within all private and public spaces. Members of the last group, who believe in the equality of spouses and agree that it is never ethically good to strike one's partner, must answer an important question. To what degree are they bound by historic interpretations? The classic tradition was univocal on the superiority of men over women. Are Muslims today restricted to the interpretations of this centuries-long tradition, or can people today return to the texts themselves and propose new interpretations? Those Muslims who do choose to reinterpret the Qur'an include many Muslim feminists who have struggled with the verse from the Qur'an that I cited before. Feminist scholars use several strategies as they approach challenging verses such as this. 1. Prioritize other parts of Scripture. These scholars turn to other passages from Scripture that more closely align to their values and use them as the foundation for a more egalitarian interpretation. In this case, there are several other passages from the Qur'an that seem to address husbands and wives together and position them on equal footing. For these interpreters, one such verse reads, "And the believers, the men and the women, are guardians one of the other. They bid to honor and forbid dishonor. They perform the prayer and pay the alms, and they obey God and his messenger. Those, upon them God will have mercy. God is almighty, all-wise." 2. Reinterpret specific words. Feminist scholars also investigate the meanings of the words used in the Qur'an and often find them to have different meanings than those assumed by their male predecessors. In this case, for example, feminist scholars have returned to 4 words and passages in this verse. Men are providers for women because God has preferred in bounty one of them over another. Righteous women are therefore obedient to God, and those with whom you fear discord, admonish them, then abandon them in their beds, then symbolically strike them. But if they are obedient to God, then do not seek means against them. God is all high, all great. For feminist interpreters, this verse does not place men in charge of women, but does acknowledge that men have often served as the providers or breadwinners for women. They see the references to obedience in this verse to refer to obedience to God, not to obedience to a husband. Feminists look at the word previously interpreted as disloyalty and read this word to refer instead to a general state of marital discord, which could be anybody or nobody's fault. Finally, these scholars turn to the most difficult word of this passage, the verb usually translated as to hit or to strike. There are several different ways that this verb has been reinterpreted. To cite just one, feminists point out that there is a story in the Qur'an in which God instructs Lot to strike his wife with a blade of grass. For these feminists, this verse could also be advocating a similarly symbolic gesture. 3, limit to a specific historic context. Many reinterpreters will take verses such as this one and limit their applicability to a specific context or historical situation. In this case, Muslim feminists have argued that in a 7th century context, in which violence against women was endemic, this verse actually served to limit the ability of a husband to beat his wife. And if the ultimate goal of the verse is to limit violence towards women and to promote justice towards all believers, then by today's standards, any kind of physical violence between spouses would be unacceptable. These various interpretations and strategies return us to the larger issue of interpretive authority. Who gets to interpret the Qur'an, and on the basis of what authority? Many of these feminist scholars received extensive education and training, some in classical Islamic institutions, others in academic universities. But does interpretation require such education, or can anyone turn to the Qur'an and seek to determine its meaning? And finally, why are some interpretations accepted by larger communities and others rejected? Although I have used a passage from the Qur'an to demonstrate the kinds of difficulties involved in interpreting scripture, the questions I have raised really apply to all authoritative texts from the past. All people who approach texts that were produced hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, will face moments when the apparent meaning of those texts does not accord with their values. We even face similar interpretive questions when facing texts like the Constitution of the United States. Who has the right to interpret this document? Does interpretation require extensive education and training, or can anyone determine and then try to enforce the meaning of the words? Are interpreters today bound by the understandings of the framers of the document, or are they free to place these words into a new context or setting? And what should contemporary readers do with the many passages regulating and governing slavery and enslaved persons? Should we excise these passages? Ignore them? Forget them? I'm going to ask you to think carefully about the relationship between someone's values and the texts they consider sacred or authoritative. Which comes first? Does someone bring their values to a text, or do the words of a text determine someone's values? Reading scripture, reading anything, requires connecting words from the past to a modern context, and that process is neither simple nor straightforward.